Ralph Ellis, intrepid researcher of biblical and other mysteries, because I've done some work on other aspects of, well, I do climate change as well. Been working on the biblical and historical mysteries for more than 40 years. So started this a long time ago. My first book was printed back in 1997, I think it was. And just been researching history from a secular historical context.
Oh, well, from Ireland, you know, and I've made several trips to the United States where I'm based. And just from about 1990, well, my public career really started about 98 in a slow way, and took off from there in the kind of a conspiracy movement. But my work was always a little bit more eclectic than that. So following in the footsteps of certain previous people, but then sort of branching away into my own thought and going much deeper happened just about 98 and afterwards. But the research I've been doing on almost any of the subjects that I've been into goes back to the 70s. This is a strange thing.
Yes, well, astrotheology is really just it's astronomy. Okay, you might call it astrology nowadays, but what they were looking at was the heavens, because the heavens governed the earth below. It governed the earth below because it creates the seasons, it creates the crops that grow, the winter and summer seasons, and later on, I suppose, the heavenly bodies could be used for predictive, for, you know, fortune telling, which was a staple diet of priests in that era. You could use the movement of the heavens to predict, and you could also use the movement of the heavens to prove your knowledge and therefore your power over the heavens, because you could tell things that were going to happen that nobody else knew. So you could bring Pharaoh up, you know, to, well, I say the top of one of the pyramids, you know, a nice viewing point so you can see the sky, and you can see it, say, well, see this star up here and see where it is in regards to the background of the other stars. It's going to move tomorrow, and I tell you it's going to move over here. And so you can amaze, you know, with your predictive powers, you can say that this planet is going to go left to right, but suddenly it's going to stop and go right to left, which the planets do, of course. Sometimes they have this stasis and then they move backwards. All of these sort of things, you know, the moon, the way it moves. Okay, everyone will know the 28-day cycle, but do they know the 19-year cycle? And you can, you know, predict what the moon is going to do and what the eclipse is going to be. You know, there's going to be an eclipse tomorrow, and everyone say, no, you're kidding us. And suddenly there's an eclipse. Well, that's power. That's astrotheology. And you can create an entire priesthood based on these predictions of what the heavens above will be doing. And that's the basis of astrotheology, and it's been the basis of most religions. If you look around the world, most of them are sort of based on stars, moon, sun, movement of the heavens. It's been a staple diet of religion, theology for thousands of years. And it still is, if they ever admitted it, within Judaism and Christianity. It's moved across into the later religions, of course, because the one was based upon the other. It's more difficult to find that nowadays, of course, because within Christianity especially, they will deny it. They will deny it within Judaism, but the proof is there on the ground. And we're probably going to have a look at one or two of those proofs in a minute.
I think all religion, and this is quite demonstrable, even a cult, even a weird Mooney's cult or Jim Jones cult, we have this heroic figure. You don't really have a religion. Think of even Hinduism, where your Krishnas and your figures there, you know, the Buddha, Arjuna, even God, Brahman. They're all heroic. They all wield bows and arrows and thunderbolts and swords. That's all pretty heavy, you know, Hollywood stuff right there, and it'll captivate the mind. And when we talk about a hero, I mean, that's an endless story. So just, you know, the Celtic mythologies have it, the Nordic mythologies, think of Thor, think of Odin. So there's one definite origin of religious thought, and that is the hero. Then you can think of the Bible or a text or a chronicle, even a Gnostic chronicle. They've got your Ialdabaoth and Sophia, you know. So it's a description that these books are the story of Ra, the story of Amun-Ra, right? And the story of Marduk or Sargon, you know. And this is great. We're still into it. Look at the Marvel comics, and not just them. So there's a heroic aspect in which we want to tell the story of the hero. And the hero starts, of course, with something very, very earthy, our father, the tribal leader, the chieftain. He wears the lion's tail. He's the lion of the tribe, the shaman. And these are the keepers of wisdom. These are the keepers of our tribe, our elders. They know what the elder, I don't know what the elders did. I couldn't tell you, but the elder of our tribe knows what the elders of the past did. And so these are people who keep away the beasts. These are the people who got us to where we were. These are the guys who will go out to fight in their sort of, you know, chariots when an enemy appears. So this heroic figure is as old as time. Even Carl Jung called it the animus, the warrior, the king archetype. And so religion can be understood in one way as giving a further story, imaginative story, because then, of course, if we're talking astrotheology, what happened? That hero figure, very earthy figure, not a perfect being, but this, look, think of the Aztecs and their worship of their leaders, and the Egyptians were all faces bow before the great pharaoh, you know, all these rituals. Then we took that figure and projected it upwards along with a lot of other figures, but just let's focus on this one for a minute. The hero gets blasted up there in the sky. He's Butes, he's Orion. You know, he's the Hercules, he's the hunter. He is the Hercules of the 12 challenges, or the 12 great rites of passage. So that's what a Jesus is. That's what a Muhammad is. It's really that simple. It's a description of a hero, and that's why it's wild and fantastic. If Jesus did something to 1,000 people, well, Muhammad had to do it to 15,000, right, and so on. And you can clearly see that this is the case in these scriptures. If it was this many people across the Red Sea, no, it was the star. They were like the stars in heaven. There was a 500 million, and then, you know, the scholar with even an IQ of 50 can tell. Don't think so. Where's all the food scraps? Where's all the onion peels? Where's the banana skins? Where's the toilets? I think we need to reduce this stuff. But the point is, that's the heroism. That's the storytelling and the myth mongering. And it is absolutely everywhere. And we don't have far to look, because there's a thing called the Holy Bible, which is the greatest exegesis on myth mongering that you could ever want to read. There all is laid out from the Hebrew Bible onwards, the millions of people that followed God, the millions who crossed the river, the millions who did this and that. Millions? What are you talking about? Simple demographics tells you impossible. Millions with all of their animals going with them and all of this nonsense, right? So it's total myth mongering. But what do we know about myth mongering? We just read it, we accept it, millions bow to it, and, you know, wear it around their necks. And nobody uses their reason or their logic to say, you know, it's just impossible to breed that many people. I don't care if it was Abraham or Joseph or Jacob or, you know, whoever, Judah, whoever. It's not possible. They left no record. Then you simply realize that's what it is. On one level, the heroic figure, Noah, he's heroic. You could throw tidal waves at him. You could throw tsunamis, but him and his little boat, they survived. What a story. Cecil beat the mill, right?
This is odd because, of course, everyone will deny it. And if you've never researched Judaism, you'll know nothing about it. And you'll say, Zodiac, Judaism, you know, you must be off your rocker, as they used to say. No, it used to be a central part of Judaism. Remember, Judaism today is not the Judaism of the past. Rabbinical Judaism, which we see in synagogues today, is nothing to do with the original Judaism that was venerated even back in the Solomonic era. Remember the United Monarchy, they were polytheistic. Okay, there was always a movement towards monotheism, but King David and King Solomon built temples to many gods. During the Babylonian exile, when the Babylonians took over Jerusalem, there was a big exile. And part of those exiles went off south to Egypt under Jeremiah, the mad priest. And those people were venerating the Queen of Heaven. It says so in the book of Jeremiah. And they were most disappointed that Jeremiah wouldn't allow them to worship the Queen of Heaven. Who's the Queen of Heaven? She's Isis, the Queen of the Stars. That was her original name. She was effectively the Queen of Sheba. Sheba means star, the Queen of the Stars. So the Egyptian Isis, the great goddess from Egypt, was the goddess who was being celebrated by the Jews who left Jerusalem. This would have been 6th century, 7th century BC. So Judaism has long been rather different to what we see today. Even 1st century, prior to the 1st century, prior to the Jewish revolt, of course, the Jews had roast sacrifice. Well, when you go to a synagogue today, you don't see a line of animals outside the synagogue waiting to be slaughtered and roasted upon a fire on the altar. But that was original Judaism, was roast sacrifice. It doesn't happen anymore. Judaism has changed. And one of the things that's changed is the veneration of the Zodiac. Now, in the 1st century, there was a movement, and I say that this was the Jesus movement, the Nazarene movement, was trying to go back to some of the old ways. We might talk about this Jesus character and his associations with Egypt later. But the Nazarene in Judea in the 1st century were obviously trying to move back to some of these old Egyptian type beliefs within Judaism. And so they created zodiacs. So if you go around now, I think about 8 of them have been discovered so far. If you look at the ancient zodiacs from Judea and Syria and Jordan that have been uncovered and excavated, you will find a very large zodiac on the floor of the synagogue. And these are synagogues. Some people have tried to deny it, but you have this very large mosaic zodiac. I mean, they're about 5 meters across. They're quite large. But at the top of the zodiac, you'll see all of the accoutrements of Judaism. You know, you'll see the temple, the Ark of the Covenant, the shofar, all of the symbology of Judaism at the top of the zodiac. And at the bottom, there are dedications saying the people who donated the money to the synagogue for the making of this zodiac. And if readers, we might actually show an image here, but if readers want to have a look, just do a Google search for the Hamat Tavera zodiac, which is on the Sea of Galilee, just below Tiberias. And it's a classical zodiac. It's the same sort of zodiac you will see if you go to Greece or Egypt. You know, if you look at the famous zodiac from Egypt, the Dendera zodiac, it's exactly the same, with all of the same characters, the same symbology. It's just written in Aramaic, of course, instead of in Greek. But all of the characters are there on the zodiac. And it's a Jewish zodiac, and it's interesting because it's a processional zodiac. The Earth wobbles on its axis as it moves around the sun. And this is a very long wobble. It's a 26,000 year wobble. And it's like a spinning gyroscope on. If you put a gyroscope down, it'll gently process. It'll go round in a circular motion. And the Earth does exactly the same. But one of the effects this precession has is it changes the constellation of the zodiac that rises at the spring equinox, the vernal equinox. every year, and it changes by 1 degree every 72 years, roughly. So you will go through a sign of the zodiac every 2,200 years, and then it'll change to the next one. And this is it's a very good way of keeping track of the millennia, of keeping track of, you know, when this particular pharaoh or king was born and reigned. Because if you associate a pharaoh with a particular sign of the zodiac, you know in which era he lived. And this has been used down the ages to denote people's place in the greater scheme of things. And that is procession. And this procession has gone down through the millennia. So you will find in Egypt, they worshipped the Apis bull because Taurus was the dominant constellation between 4,500 years ago and between 4,500 BC and 1700 BC. Taurus was dominant, excuse me. And then we had the era of Aries. And then we had the rise of the shepherd kings in Egypt, because they venerated the sheep, Aries. And also all of the patriarchs in the Old Testament were called shepherds. Okay, that's nothing to do with agriculture. It's everything to do with their religion and the dominant constellation at that time. And then, of course, Jesus adopted the same thing. He was born as a Lamb of God, but became a fisher of men. Why? Because Aries changed to Pisces in about AD 10, so he was the first of the fisher kings, which tells us that this processional zodiac was still being venerated in the 1st century. And this zodiac at on the Sea of Galilee at Hamat Tavera is a processional zodiac. The head of the sun points at the division between Aries and Pisces, which is telling us that this is a 1st century zodiac.
But then on a much more profound philosophical level, to answer your question about religion, whether it's Christianity or not, is this extraordinary philosophical fact that ancient man was very up close to the mystery. And there's really no other word for it. You could call it sublime if you wanted to, and it would be quite right. But we're locked into our little cages of our cities. They were not. They were there with the thunder and the lightning. They were there with the earth, up close to the earth. Their survival depended on being very up close to nature and animals and their ways. And they're also living in nature. They didn't have cities. And so one origin of religion is just the giant mystery. When you look at the mystery, you find it's really big, right? You look at it's not just mystery, it's a giant mystery. Look at the cosmos. Look at the universe. Vaster than any mind can hold. And their little minds at the time, like our minds right now, couldn't grasp it. And so that then caused awe and wonder. But wherever there's awe and wonder, there's also fear and trepidation. This is, slowly going to the answer to your question. That mystery isn't just beauteous. It's also frightening. Think of a child's mind going out and looking at the Grand Canyon, a child's mind going and looking at the roaring ocean, and then being told there's horrible monsters in the sea. Don't go in there, you could be eaten or whatever. You could be drowned. So wherever there's a majesty, and wherever that sublime exists, think of Marco Polo. If you actually read a lot of the documents of the first pioneering travelers and discoverers of lands, they're actually telling you right in there that they were filled with fear. Exactly at the moment when they were also contacting the beauty. It's right there phenomenologically in their works. So there's something about the great mystery. We've insulated ourselves from it. So modern man doesn't know what I'm talking about, because we live in these cities where the lights are so bright and they're kept on day and night. You can't even see the stars. So there's no mystery anymore. But in those days there was, and it was frightening to a degree. It brought awe and wonder, but it also brought a feeling of trepidation and sort of anxiety almost. It's very strange to say that, but the sublime, the beautiful, the awesome, also strikes in us a kind of anxiety because we can't find where it's plugged in. The anxiety arises because it is so majestic and so vast, but I'm just little old me. Right.
So here we are. We have this wonderful zodiac, and it's interesting. It's interesting, A, because it demonstrates that Judaism did venerate the zodiac. It's interesting because it's processional, so they understood the procession of the equinox. It's interesting because the central character, remember, this is a Jewish zodiac, quite overtly Jewish, but the central character is Helios, the sun. So they've adopted a Greek manifestation of the sun. So you've got Helios on his chariot charging across the skies, who is the sun character. And he's holding in his hand a blue-green spherical earth. Okay, so this is 1st century, and they understood that the earth was blue-green spherical, and it was being held in the gravitational grasp of Helios the sun. So they understood the heliocentric model of the solar system. 1st century, long before Copernicus, which is why they always called Copernicus a bit of a fraud. He didn't deduce the heliocentric system. He only just read some books, from ancient history. And what else about this zodiac? Oh yes, well, it shows us where the basis of the New Testament came from as well, because we have a zodiac surrounded by 12 signs of the constellations of the zodiac. A central sun figure, a central figure surrounded by 12 disciples. It is the basis of what Jesus was doing with his own church. It was the Jesus character surrounded by 12 disciples. And we know that that is what he was doing, because if you look just slightly further south, just to the south of the Sea of Galilee, you'll come to Bet Shean, which is another ancient Roman town on the Sea of Galilee. And there they have a Christian zodiac. So now we're talking 6 centuries later, we're talking 6th century AD roughly, and they built another zodiac, but they call it a calendar because it denotes the months of the year instead of the constellations of the zodiac. But of course, each month is coincident with a constellation in the sky. That's how it all works. So here down at Bet Shean, they have a circular zodiac, exactly the same. And the 12 signs of the zodiac are now 12 men. And in the center of the zodiac, we have a man and a woman. One is the sun, the other is the moon. Sun and moon together, surrounded by the 12 disciples. It's pretty obvious what they're trying to do. The constellations have now become disciples, so the 12 disciples were the 12 constellations. The one was based upon the other. And the interesting thing about this particular zodiac is in the center, you don't just get the sun symbol like you do in the previous one. Now you get the sun and the moon. You get the Jesus and Mary character. There is a male character and a female character. One has the darting rays of the sun on his head. The other has the crescent moon on her head. And they are there at the center of the zodiac, the sun and the moon, the Jesus and Mary. It's pretty obvious that one of the basic aspects of early Christianity, remember this is Nazarene Judaic Christianity. Remember that Jesus wasn't really a Christian, he was a Jew, and he was the leader of the Nazarene church. Okay, that's not exactly the same as Christianity. Christianity was an offshoot of that, courtesy of Saul, St. Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament. So it was his interpretation of Nazarene Judaism. It wasn't the original Nazarene Judaism. So the offshoot Christianity took the same sort of astrotheology, the same signs of the zodiac, and made it more, as it were, Christian, based more upon Jesus and the disciples than the signs of the zodiac in the sky. But it's the same religion, it's just evolved slightly.
72 is one of the most important numbers, and it stayed important right up to the time of the Medicis and the Renaissance, because it really represented each degree of the zodiac. So they broke the zodiac down. If you do it by degree, you get, it's like this. There's a 25,920 year cycle, which is called the Platonic year or the Great Year. Then you break them down into the famous, 12 signs. Well, the 12 signs are 30 degrees each. And it takes 2,160 years for the sun to go even through one 30-degree arc. But that means that if you divide it, you get 72 to go through 1 degree of the zodiac. And therefore, this influenced this astrotheological or astrological or astronomical fact affected the kind of Hermetic philosophers, in which they attributed the number 72 to the year, to man. So you have the great circle of the zodiac, but man is one little dot. That's why you have a degree. It's a little circle, 33 degrees. And so before the sun, as the sun approaches to leave a sign, it's at the 30th mark. But the sun is itself a few degrees, isn't it? So really, they said, after about 33 degrees, it has vacated that sign and moved into another. And then they went further. They said, well, look, each degree of arc is 72 years. So 72 looked like the average age of man, and it stuck. Then 72, I believe, is one of the arcs, one of the vertices of a pentacle, a pentagram. And they saw it in geometry, 36 and 72, all these numbers that add to 9. So for convenience, 9 became the number of man as well, but they knew that inside 9 is 72 or 36. And that's the pentagram, which has long stood, again, it's a totally manifold symbol, but it also has stood for the mysteries of man. By the time you get to somebody in the Renaissance like Cornelius Agrippa, Paracelsus, this is when they're showing man. Remember, in the famous Leonardo da Vinci also did it, but he got it from a guy called Vitruvius, who was an immense architect, a brilliant architect. You had Niccolo Pacioli. It became a standard in magic of the Renaissance. Finally, John Dee, all of these characters, it became a standard to represent man by the pentagram. It's actually kind of odd because it's really more a female symbol, but let's not bother getting into that. It just started to stand for man in a certain aspect. What aspect? Well, perfection. And by the way, your body conforms to a lot of those numbers too. So it was quite right to take those numbers and attribute it to man once you start getting into all the sacred geometry. Fibonacci would be another one who definitely believed that and elaborated upon it. But what is that man standing in the 5, like Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian man? It's the man who's called anthropos, man who's perfected, man who knows that his body's built out of exactly the same proportions as the divine universe, man who understood that he was God. This is not a heretical statement. This is a statement to celebrate the real spirit. If thou hast made me in the mirror, as the mirror of the universe, as above, so below, say the Hermetic tradition, then I can speak as God. So Adam, right? Anthropos, Adam Kadmon. We lost it. Yeah, the Dark Ages came, the Christians, they decided this was all going to be burned and thrown out. And it was resurrected by the Medicis. But again, it just entered only into a sort of a high intellectual, Pico della Mirandolas and all of that, we're grasping it. And the high brains. But for the local yokel, forget it. If there's any Adam Kadmon, it's that fella at the end of their street there in the church. And his God is Jesus. That's all a perfection you need. Oh yeah, throw in Mother Mary and a couple of others as well. Not you. You're just good for catching the rats. Off you go, mate. Get back into the fields. Don't talk to us about anything of this high nature. But once upon a time, in some good old days in the past, this was something that was universally understood. And the mystery schools, that was the key for them.
Yes. Well, obviously they weren't speaking English, but it sort of still works within Greek as well, because the original texts we have are mostly Greek. And that symbology, that change in pronunciation works in the Greek as well. So yes, he could well be the son, as it were, of God. And he is identified with the sun. If you look at these particular zodiacs we've been talking about, the central character in these zodiacs is the sun as a person, Helios, surrounded by his 12 disciples. And Jesus was the Son surrounded by his 12 disciples. If you look at the Bet Shean one, it's Jesus and Mary surrounded by their 12 disciples. It's the same imagery. And we know this from Arthurian legend. Now, before I talk about Arthurian legend, I should point out that a lot of Arthurian legend is actually historical. Okay, there's a lot of mythology there as well, which we can go into later, but it's there is a lot of historical information within Arthurian legend. It's a vast corpus of work. It's 5,000 pages of Arthurian legend. You know, there's a lot of history there, which comes out of the 12th century, 13th century, and within Arthurian legend. Oh, of course, the other thing within Arthurian legend is one of the main characters in Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea. Okay, there's a big dichotomy there because, Arthur is supposed to be 6th century, but one of the chief characters within this story that they are telling is Joseph of Arimathea, the guy who took Jesus down from the cross. And so there's a lot of pseudo-biblical material within these books. And one of the things they say is because we have the same imagery. We have Arthur surrounded by his 12 knights of the Round Table. Now, within Arthurian legend, it is said that the Last Supper table was a round table. So the table of King Arthur and his 12 knights was a copy of the Last Supper table of Jesus surrounded by his 12 disciples. It's the same imagery because they were mimicking the same events 600 years later on with Arthur and his 12 knights. And so the original Last Supper table would have been a table surrounded by 12 disciples. And what is a table surrounded by 12 disciples? It's a zodiac. So the original Last Supper table would have been a zodiac. And it was probably a real table, like the one if you go down to Winchester, you will see a real round table, which comes out of the 14th century. It's very early anyway. There is an enormous round table painted with the Arthurian knights all around this table. It was probably a real table, just like this, that Jesus and his 12 disciples sat around. And that's why it became so famous. And that's why it ended up within Arthurian legend and also in the 13th century being recreated during the medieval period. And of course, the center of that table is the sun character. That's where the sun sits. It sits at the center of the zodiac. And so, yes, of course, the Jesus character, the leader of these 12 disciples, these 12 signs of the zodiac, would have been associated with the sun because that was his position. And no doubt all of the disciples would have been associated with a particular sign of the zodiac. And that's where probably we get the characteristics of each sign of the zodiac. Some are supposed to be peaceable, some are more aggressive. That was probably the characters of the disciples who took those particular signs of the zodiac. Yeah, that was I don't like to use the word cult, but that was the religion that he created. Remember, the Jesus religion was a new, well, I wouldn't say new religion, but it was a cult within Judaism. It wasn't following traditional Judaism. It was a new cult that had been created at that time. And that's what it was following. It was following the old traditions of the Zodiac within Egypt.
Oh, yes. Well, you see, this is a discovery that has really intrigued people. And the best guy who explains it, you've had him on the show numerous times, Ralph Ellis. Because when Ralph's work came along, it was like, did somebody just leave the, Aladdin's cave open or whatever? Because I'd been having these questions since the 70s and paying quite special attention to those that weren't answered. After reading very, very widely from all the greatest scholars you can imagine, and the list is endless. Well, as far as I was concerned, some things weren't answered correctly. And then in the mid 90s, or actually late 90s, when Ralph's books started coming out, it was just like click, 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 done. Now, okay, there's a few other guys out there to be credited as well. Tony Bushby, it's not that he was the only one that nailed it, but he is by all standards, the preeminent answer giver to some of the more, there's Moata Ashby is a good writer. It's not to say that there hasn't been very, very great people out there helping nail certain things and giving you that desperate insight that you needed, There are many, but it's just towering. His work is towering. People should have every book he ever wrote. So he describes this in astrotheological terms, which immediately gelled with me. Suddenly it made absolute sense why they did that. Why the golden calf and not the golden bunny or something, the camel. No, it was a bull because something was taking place in that exact era chronologically. And that was the movement of the sun from the sign of Pisces, from the sign of Taurus into the sign of Pisces. And Ralph brilliantly shows you how that incident, which had been predicted when it actually hit or when it was happening, caused a major rift in Egypt because the psychopathic king Akhenaten took this to complete heart. I mean, he just wanted to completely transform Egypt from the worship, not just of the bull, that just represented a cult, the cult of Thebes, the cult of the Amonists. And Amonists are actually a very interesting group when you study them. I actually call them Druids. And I actually, in my work, show you that the Amonists and the Druids were one group, spread internationally over the world. The Amonists knew about the Druids, and the Druids knew about the Amonists. This is one of the most extraordinary things about it, because ultimately it was a cult, and that cult was worldwide. But along comes the Akhenaten cult. They were kind of floating around, but they didn't have the budget, so to speak, before that. In Akhenaten, he said, right, this is it. I'm taking this obscure cult of my fathers, and we're going to go to town with it. And so disturbed the status quo in Egypt that basically Egypt was, on the brink of destruction. It's an amazing story, this. In fact, it's even more amazing when you realize that the Exodus in the Bible actually refers directly to this. It refers to two different Exoduses, but this is one of them. When Egypt got fed up with Akhenaten and threw him out. And when they threw him out, his tribe leaves. Whether he was dead or not is a bit dodgy, right? That can never be ascertained. My feeling is he was dead. But as they go through the wilderness, in my narrative, it's his daughter that takes over, but maybe that will be too big a story. So they go through the desert. They put up the brazen standard. They put it up because little serpents are biting them. I think we're getting into the realm of Cecil B. DeMille again, but they cross the Red Sea, the Pharaoh's charging after them. But long after that period, they're starving in the desert, they're going through, and then he has to put up this sort of apotropaic totem. And that's an incredible story that I go into in the Female Illuminati presentation, which is on Unslaved, what that really is all about. It's absolutely incredible. But one incident where they talk about is that they had to do this because little snakes were pestering them and biting them. So by putting up the standard, they would ward them off. As you said earlier about the numbers and the various coded symbolism, little snakes does not mean locusts, little snakes, or anything else. It's a symbol of something. It's a term that was used from one cult to the other. All right, it's not much different when they cross the desert, get to Sinai. And by the way, Sinai, as Ralph Ellis will tell you, is just another euphemism for the Great Pyramid. So again, as I say, clickety click, 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 click. And extra important for somebody who's been slaving in the mines trying to work out all of this stuff and just can't make this, can't make it, can't pull out of the river, the fish. So Ralph's work is, again, as I say, preeminent. Anyway, he goes on to say that then as Moses ascends the mountain, and that's all to be taken symbolically, can be related to stars, related to the sun. Well, anyway, the famous story is down they are, they're the holy people with all this gold and silver, the slaves, yeah, slaves normally do carry a lot of cash on them, actually. Have you haven't noticed that? And yeah, they can have a few billion in gold, and yeah, that's the story, right? No worries there. Don't complain about that. Don't ask anybody to explain. Well, they start getting orgiastic, right? The holy people don't want to do anything with Jehovah anymore, right? So they start building this big calf, and it's not restricted to what Ralph Ellis says, but by God, it's one of the chief explanations. It's just simply that they're regressing to the age of Taurus. Priests amongst them said, things are happening bad because we're, okay, even if there is this age of Aries coming, it's later, like we've got today with the age of Aquarius. We shouldn't be so quick to defile the gods. Now, the king Heremheb, the pharaoh at the time that they had just defied and left, he was known as the Great Bull. So on a secondary level, the bull is to celebrate Heremheb. Hey, we don't really hate you. Don't come and slaughter us. Hey, and maybe some of us are even going to go back. So this is what it was. It was a totem, a little bit of the middle finger to Moses, who was Akhenaten. Say, yeah, I don't think we're going to go with your nonsense. You've just led us into a wilderness. So maybe we're going to go back to the worship of Heremheb. And, in those days, you raised a totem or you raised a flag or an emblem. And so you have that. All it represents is one more of the endless rivalries between these cults, or as we might say today, tribes. But tribes bullshit. Anybody who knows the Bible and the word tribe comes up, it's nothing to do with tribes. It's to do with cult divisions. The many priestarchies and sub-priestarchies that existed. Many of them were female. So who is Zipporah then? Can you read Zipporah different, Moses' wife? Can you read Salome different? Can you read Miriamne and Herod's wife and all of that? Can we start, well, no. What about Mary? Who the hell is she? Well, Ralph dug her up, but I guess the cameras are turned off at that point. Yeah, we don't want to know about who she really was and the French connection and all of that. So they're lies, right? But Taurus is an age lasting approximately 2,000 years. A new age was coming, and the Akhenaten Atenists said, let's prepare early. In a way, that's quite sensible, isn't it? And if you're enthusiastic, the word, I think one of the words enthusiasm or whatever, is phallic. It brings up this idea of being, urgent and ready and prone. And so they want to say, we're going to welcome in the sun into the sign of Aries now, and we're going to do it without any contradiction from any of these other plonkers. They're dated, they're dusty. And so in their ardor, right, they wanted to set the age of Aries up. But the Theban Ammonists were too strong, and the people didn't like Akhenaten's desecrations anyway, and so it failed. And so it had to go out into the desert, as they say, but that really is another euphemism. Deserts, the first usage of the word desert is purely astrotheological. That's why every culture has that motif, by the way. It had nothing to do with causing a physical desert. And pharaohs who are whose wealth is beyond the dreams of avarice, don't usually cross deserts as paupers. That doesn't quite fit. No, they're welcomed in every other country outside Egypt as absolute royalty. There's kings will get off their throne to let a pharaoh sit on it, say, well, we're just satellites of your great, and this was the case. This hasn't been told to people. But as far away as Italy, as far away as Greece, the pharaoh of Egypt was the god of all gods. Make way for the god of all gods. And it wasn't any different with Akhenaten. Right? He could go to Persia, he could go to Babylon, and if not sit in the king's chair, at least his family was considered like a duke. Absolute aristocracy. All heads bowed to these men. There's no crossing the desert and going, can we eat some spiders and locusts, please? They're just delicious. No. The whole story is bogus. It's something completely different than people have been led to believe.
Yes. Now this is something I've deduced myself, and that causes some consternation. I've written historical works and I've written scientific works. I do work in paleoclimatology and things of that nature. And within the scientific world, you're supposed to quote people all the time. So whatever you write within your thesis, whether it's historical or scientific, you're supposed to put a note with where you got this information from. And well, normally you can do that. But sometimes, of course, you're doing original research. And they seem to get very upset if you do something that's original, and they'll say, where did you get this information from? And I'll say, well, it was original research. This is my idea. Oh, but you're supposed to quote from someone. Well, no, this is original research. And this is one of these pieces of original research because I've not seen this in any other reference book. But of course, we have the gods, very early gods, Nut and Geb in Egypt. And Geb is the earth god lying on the ground. And Nut is the cosmic goddess, because there are always duality, of course, male and female. And she is the cosmic goddess arching her body across the sky. But if you look up at the night sky, and of course, these people would have not had street lighting, so the night sky would have been obvious to anyone looking out. It would have, the whole world at night would be the cosmos above. And if you look at the cosmos, what you see is the Milky Way arching her body across the sky. And if you look closely, as the Milky Way comes down towards the horizon, it seems to divide into two arms, two legs. And so it's pretty obvious to me that Geb was the Earth and Nut was the Milky Way. And so everything within, we were talking about astrotheology. And so the Egyptians made Nut as the Milky Way. And we've used her in several other locations in history. And I sort of mentioned that throughout my books, that this symbolism has been used in other parts of history. So yeah, and it seems so obvious. You look at the Milky Way arching across the sky and you say, well, that's Nut. Surely that's the goddess Nut.
The inner zodiac, yeah, this is its roots. Now, there is a possibility that the zodiac itself that we know, no, not a possibility, it comes from a seven. Right? It comes from a zodiac of 7 signs. And you cannot date that ancient zodiac. It's the zodiac of the stellar cult, and it cannot be dated. It could be as old as 30,000 years. And the Astrotheology book goes into this. And that zodiac was centered around the pole, not the ecliptic. So in the evolution of the zodiac, you find out something absolutely amazing. And that the ancient observers, the ancient stellar priesthood, observed the pole movement, can you believe it? And notice that it had what was called 7 stations. And this is why the number 7 has the symbolism attached to it that it still does today, as being this extremely august number. And it was also called the Temple of the Seven Jackals. It was called the Temple of the 7 Crowns. And in the Astrotheology book, we have chapters on that. And a lot of the symbolism of that particular earliest zodiac appears on alcohol, on whiskey bottles, on flags. You wouldn't believe it. And I get into that. That's why that book exists, is to show you just how this is not dead. Right? This iconography from the earliest old brain, the first projection of the zodiac, corresponded with the polar axis. And that was called well, in Egypt, it's called the Fields of Aru, A-A-R-U. And it's where we get our Elysian fields. Elysian Fields originally was the circumpolar orbit. And nobody talks about this in astrotheology. You've got to really go to the masters to find it. Books that are now hundreds of years old. And this is the original zodiac. That this got embellished by the solar cult when their god moves on the ecliptic. Just says, well, we're going to throw out the old jackal god, to hell with all that. We're going to put our moon, the lunar cult had their 13 zodiac, the solar one. And so the zodiac we've got is already young. And as I said, the original zodiac had 88. So it evolved out of an old stellar. The stellar cult ruled the world for thousands of years. You could multiply. In fact, the ages of Egypt already triple, right? The ages of the modern world from the time of Rome and Greece to today. You can triple that to just know Egypt. But that's still a very poor reading because the stellar cult goes 3 times longer than that. It's off the charts. So they started with the 7, and probably they're the ones who widened the zodiac into the 10 or the 13 that came later, and then that was appropriated by the solar cult. But the most important thing to remember is that the number 7 is fundamental to this. And that the original zodiac had 7 animals, 7 poles. So in the Bible, it turns up as the 7 scrolls. In Judaism, it turns up as the 7 candelabra, right? Which already you can find in loads of nursery rhymes and poems. The age of the 7 sons, the 7 brothers, the 7 rivals, the 7 sleepers. C.S. Lewis draws upon it in his Narnia Chronicles. The castle with the 7 turrets, and the 7 knights, the 7 maidens. On and on it goes. Does not pertain to the Western zodiac, the tropical zodiac. And the story of the circumpolar, I had to do 2 volumes on that. They're called the Tree of Life. The Trees of Life double volume is entirely dedicated to an exploration of that original stellar zodiac. What a story it is.
Image. I do have a couple of images on my computer of paintings. We're talking from the 17th, 18th centuries, so a few hundred years ago, that depict the 12 tribes as the 12 signs of the zodiac. And so you have the 12 tribes pitched around the tabernacle. They went out into the desert and they had the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle, and around the tabernacle enclosure you have the 12 tribes, and each one is notated as being a sign of the zodiac. So that's been known about for many centuries. And yeah, I've just picked up on that, obviously, and run with it. And I've taken it, obviously, into the disciples, which people don't tend to do. I've taken it into the zodiacs from Israel that we discussed in a previous lecture. And I've taken it into Arthurian legend as well, with their 12 knights of the round table. It's the same symbolism that has been, again, carried down through the centuries.
Following those trails until today, but on my own podcast, we've not done anything on astrotheology since the beginning. Don't know why. So when you called, it was like, oh, great, finally somebody's interested in this subject, because it's been neglected, even in my own work and on Slave podcast. We just haven't had time or the inclination to get into it. And you have to do that with somebody who already knows a little bit about it. We've had Ralph Ellis on and everything, but usually astrotheology, again, just comes in for a second, and then, we move on to other things that he's been into. So it's sad in a way that, a subject of such importance, sidereal astrology, whatever you want to call it, gets waylaid. It really should be always kept in the narrative.
It's not a fad. It's very ancient. And it is the foundation for all modern religions. Across the world, pretty much, all religions are based on astrotheology, because that's what man wanted to know about. Man wanted to know in those ancient times. Remember, these texts 3,000 years ago, whenever 2,000 years ago, depending on the text. Man wanted to know his place in the universe. And you've got to remember, in your daily life, there were no streetlights. So when you stepped out at night, not being able to do anything because there was precious little light in your house, when you stepped out at night, all you could see was the heavens above you. And people who have not been out of a city probably won't understand what that looks like. If you go to the middle of an Australian desert, you will see the cosmos. You will see the dome of the cosmos above you, and the stars will go all the way down to the very horizon. And you're sitting under this great dome of the heavens above you. It's quite dramatic. And that's what they would have seen almost every night. And that had to be connected with the gods. I mean, these stars were moving. You could see they were moving during the night. They moved with the seasons. They moved with the years. That, all of that, those great cycles had to be something to do with the gods. This is where astrotheology came from. And those movements were linked to human beings. The menstrual cycle of a woman is linked to the orbit of the sun, of the moon. They would have known that. I mean, it's so obvious that, those two cycles, the moon and the menstrual cycle, are intimately linked. The processional cycle has often been linked to the life of a man. 1 degree of procession is 72 years. A man lives 1 degree of procession. If these aspects were linked to astrotheology, then surely all other events on the earth were linked in some way to the cosmos. Remember the old Masonic adage, as above, so below. What happens above us will happen on earth as well. And so, the modern priesthood can suppress astrotheology, but it will always rise again, because we want to know what's out there. What does it mean? Are we alone in the universe? These are some of the great questions that we still have today. And so astrotheology will always come back into what people are thinking and discussing. And, this is the basis of modern astronomy. Why do we have astronomy? It's the search for the unknown, the same search that they were doing 3,000 years ago. To quote a famous TV series, to boldly go where no man has gone before. That's what it's all about. So yeah, astrotheology, the link between religion and the heavens above, will always be a central part of theology, always.